This is the story of the highest jumper in the world, Isaiah Rivera. So prior to Isaiah working with me, he was on a program called Bounce Kit. The problem is that Isaiah formed a lot of knee pain at the time. It was a block periodization model, meaning that you did just strength, just power, and then just jumping. And typically when he got to the just jumping phase, he had a lot of issues. This worked for some people, but for Isaiah specifically, he was super injury prone. One of our good friends, Austin Burke, introduces us, and he starts on a load management protocol. So this load management protocol started with isometrics, then we did heavy slow resistance training, then we got into depth drops, and then we got progressively into jumps. We do this for about 2 to 3 months, and we get into 2018, the summer, and he does something called dunk camp. This is the very first year, and this is actually where I gave my first lecture ever, and what actually kind of introduced me to the dunk community. So I vividly remember him during the lifting section after his first jump session. He tested, I think, 43 and a half, or he touched like 11.8 and a half or 11.9. And he was trying to front squat, and he had a lot of pain at the very bottom. We were just front squatting the bar, mind you, and he was not able to stand up with just the bar without excruciating levels of pain. Prior to this, he was actually in so much pain, he would walk backwards up and down stairs to avoid loading his knee, and this was mostly the result of over jumping. He was doing very frequent sessions, oftentimes jumping 3 to 6 times a week, which obviously was far above the capacity of his tendon and was the major instigator of his tendon pain. You'll also notice a parallel between Isaiah and myself. So I actually stopped coaching in 2018. I gave up on my goals, which I'll get to in another video. And during this time, Isaiah didn't have a lot of direction. So he tried a desystemized version of what I had prescribed for him in load management, but with a lot of other novel training theories about knee pain and tendon pain. He ends up doing this for about 6 months, and his vertical decreases very, very significantly. His tendon pain actually comes back after his first session, after taking months and months and months off, whenever we had him to a point where he was able to do about a session or 2 sessions a week in the previous months. So in November of 2018, he's introduced to another program that was claiming that they could help him completely get rid of his knee pain, but to his surprise, this doesn't happen. So then 2019, after I have returned to coaching again, I've kind of decided that I want to actually start online coaching, and I've started my business THP. He comes to me and asks me to coach him again. I obviously say, yes, I would love to coach you again. And at this time, I maybe have 20 or so online athletes that I'm working with. So mind you, Isaiah wanted to do normal training, and he was fairly fit. He knew the load management principles, and so we were able to move into long conjugate sequence systems, which is a more complex periodization model, but it also yields really, really strong results for track and field athletes specifically, and now we know dunking athletes. So January 2019, he finishes his first macro cycle. Remember, a macro cycle is anywhere from 3 to 6 months, 3 to 6 mesocycles, and he gets to a point where he actually jumps 46 and a half inches, we think. We didn't measure the vertex, so we don't know for sure, but he touched anywhere from about 11.10 to 12 feet. We think the vertex was leaning because typically they are, and we've measured this a handful of times, but we think it was around 11.11. So at this point, Isaiah is incredibly bought into THP, which is translating human performance. THP strength actually wasn't a thing, it was just my business at the time, and he does his second macro cycle. However, right at the end of this macro cycle, he actually pulls his quad right before going to K54 and doing Dunk Camp 2019. Now this event was massive. Michael Jordan was rumored to be there. There were a ton of NBA superstars, and this was one of Isaiah's long-term life goals, was to be able to go to this event and absolutely crush it. So we're at the court one day, and I'm visiting Florida, and I'm doing my isometrics, and I tell him, hey, if you're going to warm up playing basketball, you need to be super careful. I don't want you to get hurt whenever you're playing basketball because you're a professional dunker and you have to travel overseas in about 8 weeks. So during this period of time, Isaiah goes up for a 360 East Bay in game and ends up tweaking his quad, doing the exact opposite of what I told him to. And it was a very, very hard pill to swallow for him at that time. Obviously, he trained incredibly hard at this point, and he's incredibly excited for this massive event, and now he has this major setback. Even though he pulled his quad, we were able to reintegrate pain-guided squat sessions and pain-guided training sessions, working around that knee injury and still able to finish the second macro cycle. He gets into K54 and actually wins that event under the Eiffel Tower in front of thousands and thousands of fans, and it was absolutely incredible as a coach and then also for him as an athlete. After this, we go to dunk camp and we're kind of nurturing his knee, and he's in the competitive season, which remains for the following about 6 months. And he goes on an absolute tear. He's winning contests, he's hitting new dunks, he's jumping incredibly high. And at this point, I think Isaiah had an incredible amount of buy-in into what we were trying to do. And at this point, our relationship started to develop as friends, and in a coach-athlete sense, we started to get really, really close. So post-competitive season, this is about the summer and fall of 2019. I'm actually coaching at Duke during this time, and I'm writing all of Isaiah's training, and he is jumping a lot, probably way more than what was prescribed. However, he was hitting a ton of new dunks. This is the first time he hit a 360 East Bay over Austin. He actually hit a 360 behind the back between the legs during this time, and a whole slew of other dunks. It's very likely during this time he probably would have tested about a 46.5, and so at this point he's gone through about 2 or 3 macro cycles, and his vertical has increased since the very beginning about 3.5 to 4 inches, along with his health increasing exponentially. So at this point his strength numbers skyrocket. His back squat goes from 315 to 365. He's doing it quite a bit deeper. His front squat goes up to 300. His power clean hits 245. And he sets a new deadlift PR with good technique at a 410, where previously the 405 was with a broken back. So his strength numbers are going up. He's sprinting a lot and he's getting quite a bit faster. He's very healthy. He's lean. And at this point, he's a whole different athlete. And I was really proud of that. And I think he would say the same. However, like Icarus flying too close to the sun, by over jumping and pushing the intensities in the weight room, he starts to form a little bit of anterior knee pain. At the time, we think this is quad tendinopathy, or it could potentially be a little bit of PFP or chondromalacia, which we had to work through by doing a lot of bottoms-up squatting and working around those painful ranges of motion. During this 4-month period, COVID is starting to hit, so he's having to do some at-home workouts, but his power clean actually got all the way up to 265 pounds before coming to North Carolina to train with me during COVID. So now we're in April 2020, and during this time, Isaiah gets some of the highest quality training he's ever had. I'm there for every single session. He actually has just paired with me, and THP Strength becomes what it is today. It becomes the business entity that it is today, and we're working together both in business, as an athlete and coach, and then we're also very good friends. This performance triangle allowed for him to not only get more security financially, which allowed him to focus more on training, but also offload a lot of the stressors that he was having with school, relationships, everything else at that time, and really allowed him to optimize every other variable in his life. So after this 6-week block, he gets his power clean all the way up to 274, which he was very, very happy about. His back squat goes up to 382, just under 385, much, much deeper, and he actually had lost quite a bit of weight, so his relative strength and power were both up, and he's consistently touching over 12, or rated about 12 feet on a measured vertec outdoors. Remember, it's COVID, so we didn't have access to any indoor courts, which made it hard for him to test really, really well. We also had him doing new dunks. For the first time, he had a 360 under both off the dribble, which for him was a massive accolade and a major success for the entire trip. However, unfortunately, his TFL pain did start at this time. He was doing a warm-up, a side squat, kind of like Goku, and all of a sudden, he felt this intense pain in the outside of his hip. Literally just a warm-up, not doing anything outside the norm. He had a proper dynamic movement type warm-up where he got his body and core temp up, but just doing this dynamic flexibility was a little bit too intense, and he started to get some impingement on the outside of his hip. So he goes home, back to Florida, and immediately decides that he's gonna try to compete with Jordan Kilgannon in a clean, and he actually hurts his back trying to clean 300 pounds. This was the start of his training having to be modified quite a bit. We had to do a lot of adjustments in terms of squatting. He wasn't able to deep back squat. He really wasn't able to put much weight on his back at all. We were able to deep front squat, which was really, really good and actually helped his front squat get up quite a bit. But even cleans were very, very difficult, pulling from the floor, deadlifts. We had to be very careful with the amount of training load that we were giving him. Despite all of this and the previous 6 weeks that he had in North Carolina training, incredibly high quality, he goes out and tests a 48-inch vertical and touches 12.1 for the first time. At this time, Isaiah's dunking even better than he was previously. He's at all-time best, and he's starting to make a name for himself globally as one of the best dunkers, as well as one of the best athletes. His strength numbers are really good, and he's jumping higher and higher and higher. In August of 2020, after focusing on keeping his back super healthy, he goes and travels up to extract Austin Burke from New Jersey, and he has a massive back flare-up that eventually plagues him until we leave for California in March of 2021. So during this time, we're all living in Los Altos, California, training someone individually in person, and Isaiah, again, gets really, really high quality training in person with me. You'll see a trend here that when Isaiah has me there to watch his sessions, he has much higher training quality, and this typically pays off in about 6 to 8 months after that training period. During this time, we did have to manage the TFL a bit and we had to manage the back a bit, but he was able to get fairly high intensities, however, having to pull back at times to make sure that we were able to keep him healthy as he was preparing to do a lot of events that summer, and we were also preparing for what we thought would be Dunk League Season 3. We're able to complete about 2 macro cycles, and at this point, his vertical is consistently 47 or 48, potentially higher, but that was the best that we were testing at that time, and he's dunking incredibly well. At this point, he goes back to dunk camp in 2021 after it being online the previous year, and he is now one of the best dunkers there. He finishes up dunk camp, moves out of California, and at this time, he's now in 29 Palms training with his wife, which was, again, one of the higher quality training periods of his life. He didn't have anything else to do, and so his training quality was really good, along with the complexity of the training becoming increasingly more difficult. During this time, he actually does Dunk League Season 3, which you guys can watch on YouTube. I believe it has millions of views at this point. And he actually loses in one of the contests where many people thought maybe should have won based on the merit of his dunking, and he decides he's gonna completely stop competing. The benefit to this is that he's really able to focus again on increasing his output in the weight room, on the track, and in his clean, squat, and every other metric that we felt was really important. So now we start macro cycle 9, which in our training we call this ZAY 3, 4, and 5. And this was very, very complex training at the time. Isaiah was relatively healthy at this point. He was hungry to get better, and he was very, very focused on improving during this period. He actually power cleans 285 for the first time prior to a little bit of a TFL and back flare up, where he then focuses on max strength, which eventually leads us into dunk camp of 2022, where he tests the infamous 50.5-inch vertical. So he actually jumped from 48 all the way to 50.5 after training for months and months and months, maybe even years. Prior to that, he started to question if it was even possible to get a 50-inch vertical, but at dunk camp, for the first time ever, he tests the coveted 50-inch vertical leap. As you'll notice, the summer is typically a competitive period, so he's competing all over the world, all the way through that summer, and actually even into October in Romania. He's doing FIBA 3x3 contests, he's doing Venice Beach contests, and he's getting a ton of events at this time after testing that 50-inch vertical. So he's on an absolute tear. Despite some of the injuries we were managing at the time, he was able to train with actually pretty high quality, and he's pretty much just doing an event every single weekend. So once he gets done with the competitive season, we start probably the most complex macro cycle he's ever done. We're now introducing plyos for the first time ever in his training in a formal macro cycle, and we're integrating that into the 3rd and 4th mesocycle of that macro cycle. We're playing around with rhythm quarter squats for the first time, we're playing around with depth jumps for the first time, we're playing around with bounding and sprints upwards of 100 to 130 meters, and his 1-foot vertical actually climbs up to about 42 inches. He hits his first Tamala on 10 feet during this time, but his 2-foot vertical actually was a bit stagnated at 49.5, along with the fact that he started to have more discomfort with his TFL. Now that started all the way back in North Carolina, but it's kind of plagued him a little bit on and off. We didn't fully understand what it was. We didn't know if it was a muscle. We didn't know if it was a tendon. He had previously been looking at different athletes who had had this problem, who had squatted really heavy, talked with other dunkers who had had this problem, and we eventually realized that it probably was a tendon, more so the IT band track and his femoral head pushing into that IT band track, causing a lot of discomfort when he was doing things like off-dribble spin dunks where he's had to jump really, really high. So at this time, he actually power cleans 300 pounds for the first time, a lifetime goal of his, and he back squats 410 pounds deep, another lifetime goal of his. As I said though, that TFL would come back to plague him and bite him in the butt when he goes to All-Star Weekend and tries to jump with the other pros. He warmed up a little bit too quickly, didn't listen to his body, and then while trying a crown, he partially tears his IT band at the IT band track. To this day, this still is a little bit of a problem that we have to manage, but we have a much better understanding of how to work through that injury, and as a result, you'll see what happens to his performance. So post-injury, we basically spend 8 months treating it like a tendon. It took incredibly, incredibly long to rehab back from this injury. If you can imagine tearing your patella or your Achilles, it's a very tedious process, and even though it wasn't a full rupture, it was incredibly painful for him at the time. I'd never seen anything like that. He was literally laying on the bench in crippling pain, something I'd never seen from Isaiah. He's one of the toughest people I know, and even to the touch, he would tell me that it was too much pressure. I'm talking very lightly pushing on the area, which demonstrated that was very, very serious. He actually opted out of getting an MRI just because at the time he felt it was going to be thousands of dollars, and we were pretty sure that it was probably some torn connective tissue. So we applied these load management principles for the following 8 months. So post summer of 2023, I actually moved to Florida, and again, at this time, I'm able to train Isaiah in person. He's fairly healthy at the time. We've pretty well figured out how to fix his TFL, which was mostly jumping right-left, offloading his left-right, and then basically doing a normal macro cycle. So now at this time, we're basically at macro cycle 10 or 12 or something at this point. We kind of lost track as the rehab wasn't necessarily a fully planned out cycle, and it was very, very fluid at that time. So he completes this entire macro cycle. We go through an isometric focus, an eccentric focus, and I'm training him harder than he's ever been trained in his entire life. We then do All-Star Weekend, which isn't necessarily optimal for his performance and testing a 51-inch vertical, but he does jump fairly well at that event. After leaving the event and unloading for about 2 weeks, he then has a session where he retests that coveted 50.5-inch vertical and is able to return to the throne as the highest jumper in the entire world. That's the video, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you're interested in being coached by us, go to teachmestrength.com.